It's very good to be in a location like this. I always get nervous when I realize that half of you may be looking at me on the big screens behind. And many times when I've been doing this, I get this sort of sense, I wonder what I look like on that screen. The trouble is, if you try to see, then it's one of those postmodern moments. All you see when you look to see what you look like is the back of your own head. I have a feeling Jacques Derrida may have said something about that. I'm not sure. Anyway, we're talking about Paul this week. When as a bishop, I take upon myself to talk about Paul, I'm always reminded of the bishop, I can't remember which one it was, who said plaintively, everywhere St. Paul went, there was a riot. Everywhere I go, they serve tea. And we might ask ourselves, what have we done to domesticate Paul to avoid the riots and sip the tea instead? What has happened to the explosive, dramatic Pauline gospel if studying it now becomes a leisure activity for those who like that kind of thing, to be fitted in between going for a jog and watching our favorite TV program? What was it in the first place that made Paul say what he said and made what he said the focus of so much anger and fear and produced so many riots and beatings and stonings and all the rest of it? Now, Paul knew none better that his gospel was bound to be seen as dangerous nonsense. We need to remind ourselves of that from time to time, because those of us who grew up in the church and those of us who've known and loved the gospel and have worshipped together for a long time often take it for granted that this is a fairly sensible thing to believe because it's what we've ordered our lives by. But it hits you in the face when you think what it was like for Paul arriving in Philippi or Thessalonica or Corinth or wherever it was. I was reminded of this a few years ago when I was at a conference, an SBL conference in Atlanta in Georgia, about, I think, 10 or 12 years ago. I was staying in a nice hotel, but away on the other side of the world, the England rugby team was playing in the final of the World Cup, playing against Australia in Australia. Now, you may not know this, but there is nothing that Australian sports people like better than beating England. And England had made it to the final against some fierce and stiff opposition, finally to confront the hosts on their own turf. For some reason, none of the television channels in my hotel were showing this match. Not quite sure why that was. So I phoned my daughter back in England, knowing she would be glued to the television, and she was ecstatic because England's rugby poster boy, Jonny Wilkinson, had won the game and the cup for England with a drop goal in the final minute of the game. Australia was crestfallen. England was ecstatic. I was ecstatic. And when you have good news like that, you want to share it. So I went out into the hotel lobby. It was about 6 in the morning, and the only people around were the concierge and some hall porters. I wanted to rush up to them and say, "Did you hear the news? England just won the cup." I wanted to hug the reception clerk and celebrate. And I realized these people probably don't even know that there was a game being played. They probably don't even know what rugby is. You might as well go out on the street in Pasadena and tell the passers-by that Zambia had beaten Zimbabwe at table tennis. You know, it may be good news to you, but it's nonsense to them. It makes no sense at all. Then came the crowning irony. As the day woke up and the conference participants began to arrive for breakfast, I looked around for anyone who knew about the game. And you may have guessed it, the first person I met who knew about the game was an Australian. So there I was with wonderful, life-changing news, and it was foolishness to the Americans and a scandal to the Australians. But for us who believed, it made us happy for a week. There are lots of boys playing rugby today because when they were little, they saw that match and they wanted to be Jonny Wilkinson when they grew up. Now, those of us who grew up knowing about the Christian faith, as I say, may need reminding that this was what it was like when Paul arrived in a new town. The world has a new Lord and he's called Jesus. What are you talking about? He was crucified. Excuse me, but God raised him from the dead. Oh, for goodness sake, give us a break, you must be crazy. Now he's in charge of the whole world and he's wanting us to join in with what he's doing in his new way of life. Every line in that announcement is either nonsense or it's scandalous, or both. And when it becomes clear that for Paul, this message will mean giving up some of the major symbols of your own world, particularly your regular trips to the various temples for festivals, for fun of various sorts, and for prayer in time of distress, in order to make sure that the city and the community are protected against possible dangers. You're going to have to give up all of that because those aren't gods there, they're non-gods, and they're bad for your health. Don't go near them. There's a new way of worshipping, a new way. But what are the neighbors going to think? This is dangerous nonsense. What will the authorities think? Might this be bad for business? In Philippi or Ephesus, at least, the answer was yes, this was bad for business. For all those reasons, people got worried and riots were likely. Oh, we don't want this kind of disruptive thing here, thank you very much. Folly to Gentiles, scandalous to Jews. But, as Paul says in various places, to us, the gospel, the good news about Jesus, about a living God who has acted in Jesus, about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus as the turning point of history, the place where heaven and earth come together and do business at last, the place where the old world was condemned and the new world was born. This message carried its own power and, surprisingly, its own new wisdom. It generated a new way of thinking, a new way of knowing, and that power and that wisdom reached out. And even though people, when they first heard it, thought this is absolutely crazy, some people found that it went right deep down inside them and transformed them from top to bottom. And with that transformation, something new came into existence. Not just a new spirituality for individuals, no, a new community, a new way of life, a way of life radically different from anything any of them had known before. From the very beginning, Christianity wasn't an individual sport like table tennis. It was a team sport like rugby. You can't do reconciliation all by yourself. And that's what the gospel was about. It made, quite simply, a world of difference. You can see that world of difference in one small but significant moment in Paul's life. And this is where I start the book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. During one of Paul's imprisonments, I'm pretty sure it was when he was in Ephesus, though that could be debated, a young man in trouble came to find him, a slave, Onesimus, who had run away from his master Philemon in a town a day or two's journey up the Lycus Valley. Paul hadn't been to that town, Colossae, but Philemon, Onesimus, his master, seems to have been probably to Ephesus and had met Paul, heard him preach, and he was one of those who had been transformed by the gospel, turned inside out. Philemon had gone back home to Colossae as a Christian. But life is never simple. The gospel produces complications as well as transformations. By the way, in case you're wondering, slavery in the ancient world, this is a sidebar, but quite an important one. Slavery in the ancient world was quite different from the slavery we've known in Western culture in the early modern period, and which tragically we are now seeing again in new forms in parts of the world. Slavery, of course, always involved treating human beings as things, as objects. And for Christians and Jews alike, the foundation story included the story of the Exodus, in which the God who made the world is revealed as the God who sets slaves free. Make no mistake about it. But in the ancient world, be clear about this, slavery had nothing to do with ethnicity or the color of your skin. Anyone could become a slave. All you had to do was lose a battle or perhaps go bankrupt. So although the institution always was dehumanizing, it was a different kind of thing to what the word says to us today. And often slaves could get free, either buy their freedom or be given their freedom, and resume a perfectly ordinary life. So it was a much more complicated thing than we think. And we've got to remind ourselves as well that in the ancient world, slavery was how things got done. It was the equivalent of electricity, gasoline, atomic power, and all the other things that we get today to work for us. And the idea of suddenly banning slavery, which we kind of want to say to Paul, you should have done that, that was no more thinkable than it would be for me to tell you here tonight in Los Angeles that you should right now give up driving your car, leave it in the parking lot, get home some other way, And you should also, by the way, give up using electricity when you get back home. That's off limits now. If you want to grumble at Paul for not telling Philemon to free all his slaves at once, then think again. Socially, culturally, that's where they were at. But what Paul does, end of sidebar, is something much more subtle, much more indicative of the new birth which had come with Jesus the Messiah. We tend to go for the grand gesture. We love grand gestures in the Western world particularly. Go on, Paul, we want to say. Tell him slavery is wicked. God is going to set them all free. Well, even if that had been possible, it wouldn't in fact have been as difficult as what Paul is asking of Philemon and also of Onesimus. Paul is asking that they be reconciled, not just that they tolerate each other, not just that they forgive one another at a distance, but of course you never need meet again. No, the gospel for runaway slaves is, first, the good news that God loves them so much that Jesus died for them, but it is, second, the news that the reconciliation they have found with the living God is also the reconciliation that must be put into effect with their brothers and sisters. That was hard for Philemon, it was hard for Onesimus, but it was central to the message and mission of Paul the Apostle. You see this quite clearly if you contrast Paul's letter to Philemon with a letter by a near contemporary of his, Pliny the Younger. We've got a whole collection of Pliny's letters. He was an aristocrat, a lawyer, a politician, a senior civil servant in the imperial bureaucracy. And he had occasion to write to a friend, a social inferior, about a young man in trouble. Not an exact parallel to Philemon and Onesimus, but not too far off either. But when we put the two letters side by side, and this is how I start the book, see, I'm just getting the plug in from time to time, but so you know where we are. When we see them side by side, there are all sorts of subtle differences, which, when we think them through, give us a sharp little spotlight on Paul's gospel and the world of difference it made, and particularly on the question of why there was such a thing as Paul's theology. Why Paul invented something which, with hindsight, we can call Christian theology, and what that new intellectual discipline was designed to do. There isn't time to go into the details on Paul and Pliny. You'll have to look at the book for that. But let's just say that in Pliny's letter, nothing changes socially. Oh, he wants his friend to do the decent thing, to be kind after a fashion. But society is not changed. Everyone keeps their place in the social order. Whereas with Paul, something quite radical has happened. He stretches out one hand and says, here is Onesimus. He is my son, my very heart, my second self. And he stretches out the other hand and says, and you, Philemon, we are partners. We're in this gospel business together. You owe me your own very self anyway. I want a return on that investment. And as Paul in this letter reaches out to both of them, we see that though he doesn't explicitly mention the death of Jesus in this letter, he is enacting the death of Jesus and its reconciling power in his pastoral ministry. It's no surprise after reading Philemon to discover that when Paul describes his own vocation and ministry in 2 Corinthians, he speaks of it as being a ministry of the new covenant in which hearts are changed, 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, a ministry then of new creation in which nothing remains the same, 2 Corinthians 5, and above all, end of 2 Corinthians 5, the ministry of reconciliation. In a sense, it would have been much easier for Paul to tell Philemon, oh, by the way, I met that slave of yours, Onesimus, but he's gone away and I don't know where he is now. And Paul could have said to Onesimus, look, just push off, go off to Philippi. There's some nice people there. You need never come back here and then it'll be all much easier. No, that's not how the gospel demand works. The good news of God in the Messiah reconciling the cosmos to himself catches up all those who believe it in the imperative to work for reconciliation at every level. The gospel is good news for runaway slaves, but as with the rest of us, the good news which transforms us makes us, for precisely that reason, stand up straight and take responsibility for living out the gospel of reconciliation in a new way, in a new world, in the new world that God has launched in the Messiah. So the gospel generates a new community precisely because it is about the generous outflowing love of God in the death of Jesus. It cannot be a message for or about isolated individuals. The ancient world knew a lot about the theory of character formation. Last time I was here at Fuller, I gave a lecture, I seem to recall, on virtue. That book was supposed to be, the book that it turned into was supposed to be called Virtue Reborn. My American publisher said we can't call it Virtue Reborn because we want to sell this book in Barnes & Noble and Americans don't buy books with the word virtue in the title. I thought, okay, right, you know best. So he called the book After You Believe. In other words, now that you have come to faith, now that you have believed, you've said a prayer or whatever, what you're going to do between then and finally when you die and whatever happens after that. As my publisher said, this book is about the embarrassing interval between the baptism and the funeral. It's a nice, nice line, that. In England, the phrase after you believe doesn't mean that. I have a good friend who lost his faith and who saw the American edition on a table when he was visiting us, and he said wistfully, after you believe, I guess that's for me. And I thought, no, it isn't actually, sorry, it's an embarrassing moment. Which book do I give him if he wants a book, whatever. But anyway, the point I'm making is that the New Testament picks up on the notion of character development, but it doesn't happen in terms of what Plato or Aristotle would have seen, which is that virtue is something you work on by yourself and for yourself. Christian virtue is equally about character development, but it begins with the sovereign grace of God in the gospel, hence virtue reborn, and it goes to work precisely as a team sport. The greatest of these is love, says Paul. And you can't do love all by yourself. The gospel is all about the new world which was born through the death and resurrection of Jesus and which goes to work through the gospel and the Spirit. And as we ponder that new world, that new way of life, which Paul believed the living God was generating and sustaining in these new communities, we become aware of a particular problem, a particular challenge. The central argument that I have made in my recent big book on Paul is all about how Paul developed a strategy to cope with that problem, how he met that challenge with one of the greatest intellectual and spiritual achievements of that age or any age. Let me put it as simply as I can. Paul knew that a community of reconciliation called into being by the gospel of Jesus the Messiah would be a fragile and brittle thing. All kinds of social and cultural and personal pressures would come upon it, and it would fall into 1,000 fragments. Paul knew in particular that the personal demands of the gospel, demands for love and reconciliation and holiness and transformation of life, that would prove far too much for any community. The strict, tight Jewish community from which he had come had its own ways of meeting the equivalent challenges. They had their cultural markers in place. They knew where they were, focused on the temple in Jerusalem. Even in the diaspora away from Jerusalem, they told the great stories which were echoing the festivals which were taking place in Jerusalem. These stories reminded them of who they were. They circumcised their baby boys as a sign of the covenant so that the very act of generation would be marked by loyalty to the one God. They married within their own people. They kept the strict food laws which marked them out from their pagan neighbors. They had an official exemption from pagan religion, and since in that world religion and society were completely intertwined, they kept apart mostly from the wider world. Okay, there's all sorts of varieties of Judaism, but for Paul, from his strict background, this is how it worked. Holiness is never easy, but it's easier if you live in a community like that, where everything is demarcated. Likewise, unity is never easy. As I say, there were many different Jewish factions and parties at the time, often with sharp dissension between them. But again, it's a lot easier if you've got those cultural markers to fence you off. That they saw as the job of Israel's law, the Torah, and it did it reasonably effectively. But Paul had glimpsed in the gospel The fact that Israel's God had now done a radically new thing. Nobody had expected a crucified Messiah. Nobody had expected that resurrection was something that would happen to one person in advance of all the others. Nobody in particular had imagined that when the old prophecies were fulfilled and Abraham's family was suddenly extended to a worldwide gathering from every nation under heaven, that such people would not have to become Jews as well. After all, if they were going to give up worshipping idols and serve a living God, how else could they do it? Of course they must become Jews. So the central argument of my book, and the one I invite you to consider with me in these days together, is that Paul's worldview, which had this new community of reconciliation at its heart, needed something new, something different, something which would sustain and enhance the life of unity and holiness to which he knew the gospel had called people. And my proposal, which I think quite radically reshapes the way we think about Paul and his ideas, is that Paul effectively invented not just some new theological dogmas, but a new discipline, a task, an activity, which we might with hindsight call Christian theology. Of course, he didn't call it that, but looking back, we can see that's where it began. This discipline was not simply about working out the different dogmas and teaching them to people and showing how they fitted together. It was about teaching people to think in a new way, so that this new thinking as an activity, as well as its new content, would sustain them in the life of unity and holiness to which they were called. And as I'm saying these words in the context of a great seminary from today's church, it seems to me appropriate that we should remind ourselves that theology is not just something you learn as a subject, nor is it just something for the elite core of Christian intellectuals to have fun with as they write books and attend seminars. Christian theology, in the sense I'm meaning it, is a task for the whole church. You know the saying, give someone a fish and you feed them for a day, teach someone to fish and you feed them for life. For Paul, it was like that with theology. Teach someone a doctrine and you may keep them sound for a day. Teach the whole church to think into God's new world, and you will establish the church as the united and holy community bringing glory to God. That is the challenge of Pauline theology. You see it in obvious passages such as the beginning of Romans 12. The first direct result of the gospel is always worship. The worship of the true God by the whole self. Present your bodies, that's your entire self, to God as a living sacrifice. The community is first and foremost the worshipping community. As we'll see, the primal sin for Paul, as for all Jews, is idolatry, and the primal act of grateful obedience is always the true worship of the true God. But for this to happen, the whole person has to be reoriented, and that means the mind. And so in Romans 12:2, he gives us a mandate which could stand as a rubric at the head of all his developed teaching. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may discern and work out in practice what God's will is. There is Paul's agenda in a nutshell. A new world has been born, and you need new kinds of thinking, the transformation of the mind, in order not only to grasp what it is that's happened, but to see what it is that you must now do to live it out. A little letter like Philemon is in itself an exercise in the transformation of the mind. Philemon is not only to act differently, Paul is getting him to think differently. And the same goes for Onesimus as well. The gospel is good news for runaway slaves and everybody else, not just because it says that the true God is the God of the Exodus, the slave-freeing God, but because it teaches masters and slaves alike new ways of thinking, which are designed not to produce pretty patterns of ideas for their own sake, but as Paul says here in Romans 12, new ways of life. Notice how thinking stands there between worship and action. That is Paul's vision. Lots of churches that do worship, fine. Sometimes they're a little light on the thinking and action. Lots of churches that do action, fine. sometimes a little light on the worship and the thinking. There are some theologians who do thinking and a bit light on worship and action. Paul's vision has them all together. And when we study his theology, as this week we're trying to do, we are therefore studying not only a set of topics, but a new way of knowing. Because theology as a task, or even as a set of topics, hardly existed in Paul's day. The Jewish people didn't and still don't do theology in the way that became characteristic in the church. Israel's God had revealed himself in the Torah, and what was required was grateful obedience. Didn't have too much to work out. Nor did the pagan thinkers get very far in their theology. They talked about theology, theologia. You find that word in Plato and Aristotle. But it's simply a sub-branch of the study of the whole world, of physics, of that which is. Well, there are the gods as well, so we write a little bit about them. Not that we know too much about them, but we can guess. But here's the point. Neither for the Jews nor for the ancient pagans did the fresh consideration of who God actually was and what he was doing play any such role as that activity came to play for Paul. For Paul, theology, both as task and as content, was load-bearing in a way it had never been before. If that sounds strange, if in our modern Western churches theology has become a hobby for the speculative intellect rather than a household activity for the community of reconciliation, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that we then find unity and holiness so apparently impossible. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul tells the church to be little babies when it comes to evil, simply not to know about all the horrible things that go on in the world, but in your thinking to be grown up, to be mature. Our contemporary world, like his, does its best to force us the other way, regaling us in the media with all the sordid details, but stopping us thinking in the new way that goes with God's new world. Paul clearly regards this maturity in thinking, which, by the way, is a major topic in the letter to Philippians, we'll come back to that tomorrow, as something for everyone. This isn't about university degrees or an intellectual elite. One of my favorite memories from my years in Durham came from a course that we ran for ordinary parishioners. There are no ordinary parishioners, but you know what I mean. A sort of theology 101 for people who had no formal theological education and in some cases very little formal education of any sort. I remember one old lady well into her 70s who spoke to me after I had handed out the certificates at the end of the course one year. It's a nice course, a bit of Bible, a bit of doctrine, a bit of church history, very basic stuff. And she said to me, you know, Bishop, I've discovered that once you get into this stuff, you'll never be bored again as long as you live. And her face was shining, the lady in her 70s. Christian theology, as conceived by Paul, is load-bearing for the united and holy community in the Messiah. It is for everyone, from runaway slaves to civic officials, from intellectual snobs to illiterate peasants. It is the activity of minds that are being transformed by the gospel, with that thinking taking its proper human maturing place between worship and action. It is indeed foolishness to the Greeks, scandalous to the Jews, but to those who are being saved, both Jew and Greek, it is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And we who try to follow in Paul's footsteps today, and this I think is one of the most urgent tasks for the church right now, we have a double problem as we try to come to terms with what he's saying. First, there is of course much to learn. But second, there is much to unlearn. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that everything we've been taught about Paul is wrong and we should give it up. Somebody said in an article about me just recently, rather snide remark, I thought, does he really think that everyone got everything wrong until he happened to take up his pen? Of course I don't think that. Give me a break. It is rather that the way the Western church has studied and taught Pauline theology has, in my view, been put in the wrong frame and the frame has produced radical distortions. Part of my aim as a first century historian, which is what I basically am, reading Paul, is gently but firmly to take his theology out of that basically Western medieval frame that it's been in for all these centuries and put it instead into the frame of the actual first century context and community where it really belongs. And as we ourselves move rapidly through changing and shifting cultures, it simply won't do to go on repeating the things we've been taught within the old frame and hoping somehow that they'll still work. We need a different approach, a fully first century approach. As I've said quite often now, we must stop giving 19th century answers to 16th century questions and start giving 21st century answers to first century questions. That is the way forward. So what was the old framework? Well, we got it from the Middle Ages. Thinking of the Middle Ages makes me need a drink, excuse me. If I have a quarrel with the 16th century reformers, it isn't that they said the wrong things, though sometimes they did and they disagreed with one another, etc. It is that they were doing their best to give biblical answers to the wrong questions. They took the questions from the late medieval Western period, particularly questions about how to be sure you were going to heaven and preferably without doing time in purgatory in between. They were not talking about God's new creation. They were not talking about the new heaven and the new earth. They were not talking about the resurrection that we are promised into that new world. That's why, as 𝗘𝗃_𝗏𝗃 pointed out, the reformers often struggled with their eschatology. The medieval eschatology that you find in, say, Dante, or indeed in Michelangelo's great Sistine Chapel painting, leaves no room for the biblical vision that you find at the end of the book of Revelation, or in Romans 8, or in 1 Corinthians 15. I'll be talking about this in the fourth of these sessions. But eschatology and soteriology, what you think is going to happen ultimately and how God rescues you so you can share in it, they are umbilically related to one another. And if your picture of God's ultimate future is skewed, your picture of how we're going to get to that future will be skewed as well. And so it was. And so many of the Pauline theologies of the last 400 years have been arrangements of Pauline topics which have been designed not to let Paul have his say in his own time and place and context, but to insist that he should comment on our questions, particularly our questions of salvation. Now, don't get me wrong, again, Paul is, of course, a theologian of salvation. I'll be talking more about that tomorrow. By foregrounding the church and its unity, as I've done tonight and as I've done in the book, I am not, as some have suggested, substituting a horizontal soteriology for a vertical one. That geometric image is in any case a very blunt instrument for understanding the Bible and Christian truth. Again, I'll come back to that. When we allow Paul to say what he's saying, rather than insisting that he must answer our questions whether he wants to or not, we find that he is challenging not so much what Luther or Calvin were addressing and arguing, as rather the framework within which they were thinking, the framework of late medieval piety and salvation theorizing. And along with that went a quite different framework too: politics, economics, religion, philosophy, culture, all of which worked quite differently in the early modern period to how they did in Paul's day. And since Paul did really believe that a new world, an entire new world, had come into being through the death and resurrection of Jesus, his gospel was teaching people how to live wisely and faithfully within and for that wider world of politics, economics, religion, and philosophy. Paul was taking every thought captive to obey the Messiah. The transformed mind is not apolitical or non-philosophical or non-religious or non-economic. It sees all these things and more through a new lens. And the new community which comes into being through the gospel is in effect a new polis under a new kyrios, a new community under a new Lord, worshipping with a new sort of sacrifice and prayer, living a life of generosity and practical sharing, and above all, thinking with a wisdom which outflanks and upstages the great philosophies of its day or any day. Part of the long legacy of Protestant thought the last 400 years is that often, sadly, it has de-skilled us today from doing these things in the fully Pauline way. We have come to Paul looking for a truncated, individualized, westernized gospel which lets our politics go their own way, which is frightened of anything religious and so rejects even good Christian liturgy, which has no impact on our economic life and which wouldn't recognize a philosophical debate if it came up and bit it on the knee. We have truncated and domesticated Paul, and it is this that causes bishops to lament that instead of the riots, we just have another cup of tea. And it's within this context that the major debates about Paul have taken place. I'm not going to say very much about this, but I just want to flag it up because those of you who've studied Paul will realize that I am, by strong implication, taking positions in relation to all sorts of debates that are going on currently. Perhaps the most important and long-lasting debate about Paul is between those who see the center of Paul's thought as justification by faith and those who see it, the center as being in Christ, incorporation into Christ, or participation. On the one side, you have Rudolf Bultmann taking forward a long tradition of Lutheran thought, which continues unabated in many circles, including many evangelical circles to this day. Justification, that's the thing. Everything else is secondary. On the other side, you have Albert Schweitzer taking forward a Reformed tradition, though now with strong resonances with first-century Judaism. Again, this line continues to this day. And the current debates about apocalyptic and salvation history and covenant theology and so on all take their rather complex places within this larger framework. And alongside these debates, that is, the discussion of how to analyze Paul's thought, how his categories actually work, whether he is employing different types of theology, and if so, if they fit together or not, alongside that, we have the old puzzle, is he really a Jewish thinker? Or has he abandoned Jewish categories? Is he really a Greek thinker, Hellenistic thinker? Many in the Protestant traditions have insisted down the years that since justification was central, and Paul said justification not by works of the law, that meant that he had basically given up on everything Jewish, so he must have got his central ideas from somewhere else, either from pagan cult or from the Caesar cult even, or perhaps from Gnosticism. And it's why some other Protestants have tried to insist, no, Paul got all his ideas from his conversion. It came whole and entire, so that when he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, that experience generated all that we find. When others have responded, no, Paul is basically a Jewish thinker, think of W.D. Davis 50 years ago or Ed Sanders 30 years ago, then we find that such people have trouble explaining how a Jewish Paul could have a serious critique of Judaism itself, which he really does seem to have done. These are the framing debates of the last generation or so. Questions of how we understand the coherence, if it is coherence, of Paul's thought on the one hand, and questions about his place within the history of thought, and particularly religious thought, on the other. Though actually, I have a problem about this blessed word religion. Another sidebar. In chapter 4 in the book, and then in chapter 13 in the book, I discuss what the word religion meant in the first century. It's completely different from what we in the Western world have come to mean by religion today. And if you wanted to say which department of a modern secular university should St. Paul be studied in, religion would be one of the last. If you don't have a department of theology, much better to study Paul in a department of politics or philosophy and not religion. As though there is a religion element to Paul, of course there is. That's not what we mean by religion, is precisely not what he would have meant. Anyway, that's an aside. But these debates are important, but they often miss the point. I have argued in my book that Paul was and remained a thoroughly Jewish thinker. I decided some years ago to try out as a thought experiment what might happen if we took the central categories of Jewish thought and imagined them being reworked and reframed around the twin poles of a crucified and risen Messiah on the one hand, and the fresh outpouring of God's Spirit on the other. And as I've run that thought experiment over the last 2 decades and developed it and tried it out in different ways, I found it enormously fruitful in terms of fresh understandings of passage after passage in Paul and fresh insights into almost every other aspect of his thought. And as I've gone back again and again to Paul's multiple overlapping worlds, his Jewish world, his Greek world, his Roman imperial world, his philosophical and cultural world, and in this book I've tried to map those quite extensively to make sure that we're not getting too much slippage in this study, then as I've done that, I've found that the sense Paul makes as a renewed Jewish thinker, if you like, as one who believes that Israel's God has now done the new thing that he'd always promised, even though it was so shatteringly different that it was bound to be scandalous to the Jews themselves, I've found that that sense was a sense which would generate and sustain the life of the community of reconciliation in that cultural and political world. The picture makes sense. Paul's theology, in the way that I'm describing it, really did become load-bearing for a community that would outthink and outlive the worlds of ancient Greece and Rome. My friends, that remains the challenge, to outthink and outlive the wider, confused, muddled worlds in which we live. And for Paul, a community that would live out the heritage of the renewed family of Abraham, in whom the Jewish Torah, though at one level set aside as being no longer necessary for the life of the community, would in another way find a strange and rich fulfillment. I'll come back to all that later. But let me say another important word about this way of approaching Paul. There is a widespread movement in America at the moment, almost nowhere else other than America, but it's powerful here, which describes Paul as, quote, an apocalyptic, unquote, thinker. This blessed word apocalyptic is one of the classic shape-shifters of the last century. It means different things to different people. But the present writers I have in mind, and sorry if this is kind of off your comfort zone, but some of you will see just how important this is. Basically, a group clustering around the great scholar J. Louis Martin and his big commentary on Galatians in the Anchor Bible. This group take that word as a signal that what Paul is talking about is God invading the cosmos to rescue it from the destructive reign of hostile demonic powers. The gospel for Martin and his followers is the good news that in the cross of Jesus, God has overthrown all the powers and launched his new creation, generating a new way of knowing as well as of living. Now, all of that, as you may tell, is something that I too affirm. I think that's very important to say all of that. But where I disagree is the corollary that Martin and the others then draw. For them, the gospel of God's vertical invasion of the world, and Martin uses that word invasion again and again, stands over against and rules out any idea of the gospel as fulfilling God's saving purposes in history. Nothing leads up to this invasion, and for some, nothing follows from it either, since this view sometimes opposes a high view of church history just as much as it opposes a high view of Jewish salvation history. For Martin and his colleagues, all that is just so much religion. And Paul opposed religion, says Martin, with a fresh revelation. Strong echoes of Barth and others at this point. And this non-historical invasion thus stands over against all attempts at covenant theology or salvation history. Now, there is much that could be said about this, but not here, you may be glad to know. I will only comment at this point that the word apocalyptic is so contested now as to be almost useless except as a label for a literary genre. Those who have worked most on Jewish apocalypses, I think of John Collins in Yale, Chris Rowland in Oxford, are firmly opposed to the way that Martin and others use this word. In particular, it's important to say that this kind of invasive vertical apocalypse, so-called, over against any kind of horizontal salvation history, is in fact gaining a lot of traction, not from the New Testament, but from its echoes of 20th century radical philosophical rejection of Hegelian schemes of an immanent process. It has strong affinities with Walter Benjamin's rejection of the imminent Marxist progress which he had formerly embraced. An idea that the world was just progressing towards a better day, and finally we reject that. No, all of that is rubbish and wreckage. The apocalypses say no, the revelation comes from the outside without build-up or immanent process. But the trouble is, in the Jewish world, and the Jewish world from which we get apocalypses of various sorts, Daniel, 4th Ezra, whatever, precisely in the Jewish world as Paul is retrieving and re-inhabiting it, the story of Israel from Abraham forward was never told as a smooth, steady, imminent doctrine of progress. From the histories of the Old Testament, 1 and 2 Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, through the Psalms and the prophets, to many of the intertestamental writings, the story of Israel was told as much as a 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗴𝗶cie, a damnation history, as a 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗴𝗏𝗃, a salvation history. In other words, it was constantly the story of how Israel kept getting it wrong and had to be rescued, sinned wickedly and got punished and then forgiven again. How, in particular, the covenant conditions at the end of Deuteronomy were fulfilled when Israel got it wrong so badly that they were sent off into exile in Babylon. In fact, Israel recapitulated in its history the story of humankind in Genesis 3 to 11. That may be part of the point. The commandment was given and broken. Israel was cast out of the garden, out of the promised land, ending up in Babel, in Babylon. And if that primal history was thus repeated in the long and sorry story of the people of God, what was required was precisely a fresh action on God's part. Yes, not a mere continuation of an immanent process. As I've argued in various places, Paul, and for that matter the gospel writers, see the events concerning Jesus not as historically isolated events that might have occurred anywhere or at any time. And people sometimes say to me, supposing Jesus had been born in Africa or in China or something, it's like saying, suppose you could have had different parents. You know, the world just would have been entirely different if that had been the case. No, that's not how they see it. They see the story of Jesus precisely as the strange and unexpected, yet in retrospect utterly appropriate fulfillments of the ancient promises. And fulfillment doesn't mean that there has been a smooth, steady process up to the light. It's rather a very surprising and shocking thing. This, it now appears, is where the narrative had been going all along, though nobody had seen it coming. One of my graduate students put it like this: God acted shockingly, surprisingly, and invasively, as he always said he would. Paul sees the crucifixion and resurrection of the Messiah and the work of the Spirit as the long-awaited and yet completely unexpected purpose-fulfilling events. You only have to look at the Emmaus Road story in Luke 24. We had hoped that he was going to redeem Israel, but look, he died on a cross. Foolish ones and slow of heart to believe what the prophets had said. This was how it had to be. That's the sequence again and again. And it is this both and apocalyptic and salvation history that makes sense of some of Paul's densest and most difficult passages. And in particular, I have argued one more time in the book that Paul, like the other early Christians and like a great many first century Jews, regarded the time in which they were living as the time of extended exile. It was the exile of which Deuteronomy had warned. It had come about in Babylon, but it had not yet ended. Exile wasn't so much a geographical reality, it was a theological and political condition. Many Jewish scholars of our day say this again and again when they look at that whole Second Temple period. And Daniel 9, if you doubt this, look at Daniel 9. Which speaks of a hugely extended exile, not 70 years, but 70 times 7 years. And we know from Second Temple texts that many Jewish thinkers were calculating when those 490 years would be up, and when, therefore, the ultimate redemption might be expected. And for Paul and the early Christians, this had happened in the events concerning Jesus. God's new day had dawned. The radical evil in the world had been dealt its death blow. God's new creation had been launched in Jesus' resurrection and was being implemented by the Spirit through the gospel. And the community of believers was therefore to be the advance guard of the new creation, the people in whom and through whom God's glory would now be revealed to all the world, as the prophets had said. And therefore, to return at last to my basic theme, this new community, consisting to its own surprise of Jews and Gentiles alike, on an equal footing, it had to be given the stability and the framework within which its life could be what, according to Scripture itself, it was supposed to be. And that, I've suggested, meant theology, both as belief and as task, and ultimately as worship and prayer. Belief and task and worship and prayer actually all run together for Paul. It's hard for us with our later categories to see that. We've separated them apart. Paul saw them as an organic whole. How does this actually work? This is the framework which is going to structure the remaining three lectures. There is a basic threefold division in Jewish thought, ancient and modern. And though these three categories all link arms with one another and support one another, it may help to separate them out. In technical language, you're talking about monotheism, election, and eschatology. In popular language, one God, one people of God, one future for God's world. Let me say just a word about how these categories work, recognizing that these are not the categories that most modern Pauline theologies have adopted. Jews, as I said, do not do theology in the way that Christians have normally done. That hasn't been necessary within their life. But when Jewish thinkers stand back and say, okay, what is it we basically believe? They answer naturally, there is one God and Israel is his people. And they answer the question of who is this God with reference to the stories, to creation and Exodus particularly. And at once we have monotheism defined in relation to election and vice versa. But why did God choose this people? Sometimes it almost appears, and you get this in a lot of Christian retrievals, sometimes it almost appears as though God chooses Israel just to have some friends, just to have a company of people who are his special people. But elsewhere, a larger vision comes into view. And I'll be talking about this in the third lecture particularly. God called Abraham to undo the sin of Adam and its consequences. Those consequences being not least the invasion of the world by hostile powers in Genesis 6, and the result in terms of human pride and arrogance summed up in the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. In Isaiah, famously, Israel is to be the light to the nations, a vocation to which Paul refers even as he revisits it. But if there is one God, the Creator, and if Israel is the people of this one God, then you have to have some kind of eschatology. Because at the moment, it certainly doesn't look as though Israel is the people of the one Creator God. It looks a real mess. God has got to do something to sort it out. So monotheism plus election equals eschatology. It's almost mathematical. There must be a future. You might remind yourself how odd that is in the ancient world. Dictionaries of early Judaism are bound to have a substantial entry on hope or eschatology. The Oxford Classical Dictionary has no such entry. Oh, you might in the ancient world hope for a better life here or hereafter, but there was no guarantee of such things. It wasn't a major category of thought. But if there is one God, the Creator, and if he is a good and wise God, and if you, Israel, after all, are his people, then something's got to happen. Rescue from exile, redemption, new creation, new exodus, resurrection, renewal inward and outward. Eschatology is of the essence. And it is this combination of beliefs, God, Israel, future, which is so characteristic of first century Jews. Many variations there always are, but that combination remains central. And this is what Paul saw fulfilled and radically rethought around Jesus and the Spirit. This is what gave him the framework which would sustain the church as the new polis, the community of reconciliation. This is the thought structure which would outflank the philosophers and take their every thought captive into a new obedience. And this is the theology that would sustain the life of worship, of sacrificial love, which is the true religion. And this is the theology that as a task, as much as a syllabus, would enable the church to be united and holy. And for Paul, all this could be summarized in many ways, but one obvious way, which is the one I've picked, would be to speak of the faithfulness of this one God, the faithfulness of this one God. God, the Creator, had not abandoned his creation, but he had come back to rescue it in person, to take back his sovereign control of it from the dark, malevolent, subhuman or superhuman forces which had usurped his rightful rule. Israel's covenant God, who called Abraham to start the family through which this eventual victory would come about, he had not forgotten the covenant. He had fulfilled it in a totally unexpected way through the death and resurrection of Israel's Messiah. Paul believed that in Jesus the Messiah, this one God had done what he told Abraham he would do, even though neither Paul nor his contemporaries had seen it coming for a moment. Even though this new moment had not arrived within a smooth continuum of salvation history. It was radically new, yet it was, after all, what God had said he would do. The apocalypse of the gospel was for Paul the unveiling not of a different God or a different purpose, but precisely of the faithfulness of the one God. You can feel the sigh of relief, personally, psychologically, theologically, the faithfulness of this one God. And that is why in two famous passages, he speaks of the gospel unveiling, disclosing, apocalypsing the 𝗘𝗃𝗍𝗴𝗲, the righteousness of God. It's as though a great curtain is ripped back when you talk about what God has done in the Messiah. The curtain is pulled back, and what you see is a faithful God. That is the basis of it all. This blessed word 𝗘𝗃𝗍𝗴𝗲 is almost as complex and contested as Apocalypse itself. We'll come back to it in the third lecture. At its heart, I believe, it refers to God's covenant faithfulness and hence his creational faithfulness, his faithfulness now unveiled in Jesus the Messiah. Paul then urges the whole church, not simply a small number of professional theologians, to a vocational task. The task of learning to think differently, to think with renewed minds and hearts, to think through the gospel and its meaning as the central activity that holds together worship and life, the living sacrifice and the thought-out obedience. And as we follow Paul's trains of thoughts in letter after letter, we find ourselves challenged to think these thoughts in our own contexts, which are quite different from the 16th century and indeed from those of 20 or 30 years ago in our own lifetimes. And it's my belief, and I hope you'll catch the flavor of this these next couple of days, that giving ourselves not only to the specific beliefs, but to the task of doing Christian theology will reframe and redefine discussions we've been used to having, not only about Paul, but about many other things besides. I will have failed if all we do is go back to the same kind of discussions we used to have and merely add a few exegetical footnotes from time to time to make it a little bit more interesting. I believe we can glimpse in Paul a new direction, a new substance, a new vocation, as much for ourselves as for his own churches. The gospel for runaway slaves in Paul's day is also the gospel for new communities in our own day. And I believe this refocused theological task will send us out as it sent Paul's churches out into the wider worlds of politics and religion, philosophy, culture, economics, everything. So that, as he says to the Philippians in chapter 2, we are to shine like lights in the world. My friends, we will only do that if we are the united and holy community. As he says in that same passage, and we will only be united and holy if we are giving ourselves to this task of theology, as again he says in the same passage. Indeed, Philippians 2 itself provides one of the most striking moments in that new theology, not only as teaching, but also as a new kind of thinking. But for that, we must wait till tomorrow. Thank you.